Me on this Independence Day Sunday as a first-generation American to have the privilege of sharing God's Word with you today.
Thank you.
2 weeks ago, actually just a week and a half ago, I was sitting in the Court of Common Pleas on a jury, listening to a case of attempted murder and felonious assault. And as I thought about all that involved in this land of the free and brave, it reminded me very seriously and deeply of our commitment as Christians, that a land is only free and brave when the children of God live out their lives publicly, together, affecting society for what is right.
Amen. Being
there for those who hurt, and seeking justice for all, at all times.
Amen.
However inconvenient that might be. And as I was watching the defendant had been shot 5 times, paralyzed from the waist down, never being able to walk again, it took my mind to a story in Genesis chapter 32, where we meet Jacob. Jacob never suffered paralysis from a bullet wound, but he did end up with a permanent limp for the rest of his life. He was not tackling another criminal, as in the court case, but he was wrestling with God.
Amen.
For God's blessing. And we as a church, as the local Northwest Church of the Nazarene, I believe that that is where we are at this point in time. We are wrestling to find God's blessing and to figure out who we are, who we want to be, and once we've got that sorted, how is God going to lead us? And so this morning I would like to spend a little bit of time looking at that story in Genesis chapter 32, looking at the story of Jacob, and I think doing a little bit of background work as well when we get to that story. We need to understand what led up to it. So I'll be reading from the New King James Version this morning, and they didn't have that in Pro Presenter, so you won't be able to see the verses on your screen in that version, but I would invite you to listen if you do not have a Bible with you this morning, and we will begin reading from chapter 32, beginning with verse 24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he, meaning Jacob, said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, the other person, "I will not let you go." Sorry, I've got it backwards. Let's read that again. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, the other person, that he hadn't yet figured out who he was, touched the socket of Jacob's hip. And the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with it. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go, unless you bless me." So he said to Jacob, "What is your name?" And Jacob said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is it that you ask about my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the muscle that shrank on his hip, which is on the hip socket. Dr. Kurt will be able to tell us the real name of that. Because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the muscle that shrank. The story of Jacob up to chapter 32 in Genesis is not a good one. Jacob is about, at this point, to end his time in exile from his father's house after he had stolen his brother Esau's birthright by tricking their blind father and thinking that he was blessing Esau. That's in chapter 27. Jacob, you see, was a schemer. He was a contriver. Life was all about him and what he could get out of it. Jacob was proud. He was arrogant. He was certainly very smart. He tricked his brother out of the firstborn's birthright. And you know that story. He fled once it was discovered what he had done. He fled with little more than the clothes on his back. You'll find that in chapter 9, verse 10. And when his trickery was unmasked, he ended up down the line in the land of Haran. That was not a glorious departure. When he arrived in the land of Haran, he encountered his uncle, whose name was Laban. That was his father's brother. Laban, like his father Isaac, in other words, Jacob's father Isaac, was a landowner, a herdsman, very wealthy in terms of flocks and land. Laban hired Jacob. He was more than a match for his nephew. For just like Jacob tricked his father into getting the birthright that was his brother's, Esau's, by being the elder brother, Laban was able to trick Jacob in turn. And you may know some of that story. Jacob arrived in the land of Haran, seeking to escape still from his brother and his family. And he stops at a well, a watering place for flocks. And while he's there, a beautiful young lady who was a shepherdess leads her flocks to the well to get water. Her name was Rachel. And as soon as he laid his eyes on that young lady, he fell in love with her, and he wanted to marry her. Rachel is Laban's daughter. Laban is Jacob's uncle. You got all of that straight now? A family affair going on right here. When he negotiated, I'm cutting a lot out of this because there's some points I want to make before we have a picnic today. When Jacob asked his uncle for Rachel's hand, his uncle negotiated with him and said, if you want Rachel's hand, you have to work for me. I'll pay you, but you have to be an overseer of my flocks for at least 7 years. He is so smitten by Rachel, Jacob agrees that he's going to stop running, he's going to settle down, and he's going to be an overseer of all the flocks of animals that Laban has. And he'll do that for 7 years. And then his uncle will give him his cousin, Rachel, as his bride. Well, you know the story. He works for those 7 years. He's very good and very gifted in what he does as an overseer of the flock. And at the end of 7 years, there's a big wedding ceremony. And you've seen those in the movies in the Middle East in biblical times. All the ladies come out in veils and all that across the face, not this way down, but this way across. And of course, it ends up not being Rachel after they've been married in the ceremony. It ends up being her older sister, Leah, who Jacob considers a little more plain looking. He goes to his uncle and he says, hey, this isn't right. You tricked me. What goes around comes around. Laban has another contract deal in hand. Well, if you'll work another 7 years for me, you can have Rachel too. Remember back in those days, having several wives was the norm. So he agrees, and he works another 7 years. Now, he's very good at being a sheep herder, and a goat herder, and an overseer of all those flocks. In fact, so much so that over the years that he works in that role, he actually ends up with a bunch of pay raises. 7 years goes by, he gets Rachel as his wife. He then negotiates for another 6 years. And if he works for him another 6 years, then he will give him as an inheritance a good portion of his flocks, of his sheep, of his camels, of his goats, of whatever flocks he has. So we find ourselves, shortly before we get into this particular passage, with several factors. Laban has increased Jacob's wages 10 times. Over how many years has he been working for him now? 14. That's a lot of years, isn't it? 2 sevens are 14. Plus he wanted half the flocks, and that was another 6. So 14 and 6. 20. So that means every other year he got a pay raise. And then at the end he gets a whole bunch of Laban's animals and flocks. So by the end of this time, why am I telling you all of this? It's not to check your math on Sunday morning. It's to tell you this. Jacob has become, despite what he did to his brother and his father, a very wealthy, influential person, and has been taken in to his uncle's huge family and has become a part of that family. He had every reason just to settle down and do nothing and stay there. But even though he'd become a wealthy man, we find that Jacob becomes so overcome with homesickness and the longing that once he has his first son born to Rachel, because Rachel could not conceive for many, many years. And when she finally did, it just stirred up something in him. Chapter 31, Jacob has to go to his uncle and say to him, I need to go back to my family. Let me be open and honest with you for the first time in my life. I want you to give me leave to go back to my family so Rachel and my son can be presented to my father. Not true. Jacob hasn't changed. He's still a schemer. He is still trying to deceive. So what he does, he leaves in the middle of the night with his wives, his kids, and all those flocks, and departs. He's never able to face up to consequences. He runs away from trouble. Jacob is still suffering the consequences of what he did 20 years before. He's a schemer. He can't face the truth. He always goes around. He's always looking out for himself first. But his uncle catches up with him in chapter 31. And there's a little confrontation in that story. He was holding on to claiming a birthright that he had stolen 20 years before. Yes, he did want to go back and see his father and see his brother and show off his son. But underneath all of that was this desire, now that he's wealthy, to go back and claim even more, and that birthright that he had stolen. Jacob is not the nicest of characters. However, if you met him on the street, he would attract your attention. You'd be impressed by his attitude of confidence and success. Someone once said, home is where you get to go and they have to let you in. Jacob has the appearance of being successful. He has the appearance of being blessed. He has the appearance of being very gifted and talented and having plenty of means. But underneath, there is still this element of he is all about Jacob. Once again, as the negotiation goes on with his uncle, they agree that he will allow him to move on, and they will separate their ways, they will build an altar, and Jacob will be able to return to see his family. Deciding to do the right thing is not always the easiest of roads to take, but it's the right road to take. But even when we know it's the right road, sometimes, if we are still all about ourselves, there's something that just isn't right. And God doesn't want that in a holiness people. He heads back towards his family's lands. But he gets scared. He thought, what will they think of me by now? Maybe they won't be impressed by all my means, by all my flocks, by all my wives and children and all my smarts. And maybe that's not going to be enough. And I'm still all about myself. So maybe I better just kind of figure out a way to check things out to see if it's still favorable and still see if this is something I'm comfortable with. So being the smart man that he is, he first sends his servants on ahead to pave the way. He sends his servants to try and meet up with Esau and some of the family members, and to see if the temperature is just about okay for him to come back home and get what he claimed the wrong way, deceitfully. Messengers come back, and what do they tell him in verse 6? Esau, he's coming. He's certainly coming to meet you. I guess that's good news. And he's bringing, guess what he's doing? He's bringing 400 men with him. Well, see, if I suspect, this is Pastor Trevor, if Jacob had been a righteous man at that point in his life, if his life was all about doing the right thing, he would never have gone down the path of thinking, 400 men, they're coming to kill us. He would have had the pure thought, the normal thought, the thought that if he was working with the Lord in all of this and following the Lord's will, 400 men, wow, isn't that great? They're all coming out. They must really have missed us for them to come with so many people. It's going to be a wonderful, fine, big reunion. But the 400 number scares him to death. So what does he decide to do? Ever the schemer, Jacob decides to divide his wealth into two groups. He separates all the flocks, all people, into two groups. He keeps one half back with him. And he sends the other half as a peace offering to Esau. So if he keeps those and walks away, I've lost half, but I've still got half. And I can handle having half for me, because half is still not bad for me. Well, he sends the half, but it still isn't enough in his mind to settle his heart. He is still worried. He is still concerned about the final outcome. Will this really work? You see, when you're all about yourself, you never really end up with peace and knowing the right way. You end up falling back on your own way, on what's comfortable to you, on what you can figure out is going to be the best outcome you can make it to be. That's what's going on with Jacob here. He is still fearful. If you look at verse 12, I wanted to make this stand a little flatter. That's why I'm going to look at my head down here. And he says that he doesn't want to be sure. He wants to be sure that he's going to escape any kind of harm. And so he decides that when he sends those flocks to him, it will be in such a way that if he takes half of them, they'll still be okay. Then he worries and he says, you know what? Maybe Esau really does truly hate me because, well, why because? Well, when you've got a guilty conscience, which you would have, when you're all about yourself, many times you have a guilty conscience. Part of you is battling the right from the wrong. He says, I could think of a better fix than just my flocks and my wealth. Still wants to cover for himself. So in verse 16, after sending flocks and gold and silver, he wants to buy his way into his favor. He gets worried by the end of the day that that's not going to work. And so he actually does something which I think would be totally unacceptable for anybody in this room. He decides to send his wives and all of his children in front of him. Because he's saying, if the flocks don't work, if the gold and the silver doesn't work, then maybe I send my wives and children. That will appease him enough that I will get through this. I'll be okay. I'll come through this in good shape. Of course, you know the final outcome of that piece of the story. When they finally do meet up down the road, Esau is there with 400 men, but is not there to set about killing his brother and all of his wives and kids and taking all the sheep and the gold and all of that. He is truly there to welcome him and to be blessed by him. But see, when you go down the path when you're thinking it's all about what you have to do and what's good for you, and you're trying to put yourself in front of everybody else, you end up with a mindset about things that can be very distorted, can be very unhelpful when you're trying to build relationships and bring people together and restore the family relationships that were broken. And then we get to this particular passage, verses 26 and 27. He sent his kids away. He sent his children away towards his brother. And he finds himself, as night is falling, all by himself. He's got nothing more to give, nothing more to give away, nothing more to appease his fears with. A stranger jumps out at him in the shadows and knocks Jacob to the ground. Jacob has no clue who this guy is. For a moment, he thinks he can hold his own and fight him off. It isn't too long, however, when he begins to realize with this opponent, this isn't just a knockdown scrap and then you're going to get up and walk away. This is going to be a life and a death struggle. And he begins to realize, as the scripture tells us, that he's not going to win this fight. He has none of his clansmen to defend him. He has none of his flocks and herds and wealth to negotiate with to get out of it. It's just him and this stranger. Have you ever been there in your life? When it finally comes down to you and God. he decides the best thing he can do is just to hold on for dear life, hoping that somehow something good is going to come out of this at the end, and they might be okay. All through that very, very long night, the stranger fights him, and he tries to cling on. Finally, towards daybreak, the stranger touches his hip socket with his finger. And whatever muscle that is, Dr. Kirk, it shrinks, just shrinks. And he can't stand it anymore. The pain is awful. But if there's one thing Jacob is he doesn't give up without a fight. He's almost at the end of himself. And yet, he clings through pain and fear to what he's already got a hold of. You ever done that? Finally, at the breaking of the day, a stranger who knew he was the winner offers to let him know. Jacob refuses until the stranger blesses him. Jacob has realized that everything that he has, everybody he owns, all the wealth at his disposal, could not help him win this battle. So whoever it is that's trying to get a hold of his heart, whoever it is that's trying to get a hold of him and shake him back to what he really needs to be, that's where the solution has to lie. And he's not willing to let go until this stranger blesses him. In fact, Jacob is so desperate for the blessing that he makes the ultimate confession when this stranger asks him what his name is. Ever wondered what's in a name? Well, back in those days, every name had a meaning. My first name is Trevor. It has a meaning. My generation, there's very few Trevors in the United States. It's you guys' generation, it's a popular name now. It's Welsh. It means big village. That's what Trevor means, big village. Person who's supposed to be very family and people oriented. What's in Jacob's name? Well, Jacob tells him his name. It's hard for Jacob to pronounce his name, to say it out loud. Jacob means supplanter. Somebody who pushes somebody out of the way to get their place. Supplanter. You've heard of cuckoos. Cuckoos are those birds that don't build their own nest, but they find the nest of another bird, and they lay their eggs in that one. And those eggs always hatch first, and when the birds come out, the cuckoo birds, they push the other fledglings and the other eggs, if there's any left, out of the nest, so that the parents raise the cuckoo bird. Jacob means supplanter. Sometimes we can get so far in the way of God's plans that we actually end up being supplanters of His will in some things. But he mentions his name. It's a confession. Jacob finally owns up to who he truly is as a person. He's a schemer. He's all about himself. He's a contriver. He'll make things work in his favor. It's him first, always. Struggle gets him to the place where he's willing to confess who he truly is. And when he confesses who he truly is, mercifully, incredibly, gracefully, the stranger says in verse 28. You will no longer be called the taker, the contriver, the supplanter, the schemer, Jacob. But you'll have an name. Your name from now on is Israel, the one who has wrestled with God and with man. In other words, the one who has wrestled with God and has come clean and has found him. Some commentators refer to this passage as an example of what we call the magnificent defeat. In the New Testament, we could look at several passages, and we don't have time today. Maybe that's another message. But the magnificent defeat, we call it holiness in the Church of Nazareth. Entire sanctification, total surrender. It's that place where we finally come to the edge of ourselves and we say, I don't want it to be about me anymore. I realize when it's about me and what I have and who I am, it never gets me anywhere where my heart is at peace, where I feel like I truly belong. And I'm tired of it all being about me. That was my story. I don't know if it's ever been your story. That was my story. I had to come to the place where I was willing to say to the Lord, thanks for your salvation. I appreciate that. I'm a Christian. I know I'm on my way to heaven. I know you. I know I have that sense of freedom that I never had before, the joy and the peace that comes from being a child of the King. But taking my life and doing with it what you want to do with it, putting aside my plans and my dreams and my goals and those of my mom and dad and those of all the people around me, and wanting it to be not about what me and my clan wants, but about what God wants for my life. I would very humbly suggest today, many a Christian finds themselves fighting God because he or she is too focused, still focused, on their own dreams and their own ambitions. Jacob named this place where he struggled with God Peniel. It means a place of struggle. I have seen God, he said, face to face, and my life is preserved. His life was preserved. You read on through the story and you find that they are all reunited. A wonderful homecoming. But you'll also notice as you read that story a couple of times. It is mentioned again for our benefit. Israel, Jacob, never walked normal again. For the rest of his life, whatever that muscle is, stayed shrunk. And he lived. He lived. A permanent reminder that it can never be about ourselves and what we think we should be able to do in our own strength. It should never be about seeking for applause and seeking for acclamation, seeking for wealth and gold and all of that. If we're truly going to be a person of the kingdom, it has to be about God and Him alone. We have to come to the end of ourselves. And we have to realize that we need to get to the place where we need to confess who we have been. And we need to hold on and ask Him to bless us. Change our name into being who He wants us to be. Then the issues of family. This side of the clan likes this, that side of the clan likes that. These people think this is important, those people think that is important. Those things will blend together, will come together, because the people will come together, because God is who they're all about going forward. We're going to share communion together on this Independence Sunday. We celebrate the freedoms that we have. The greatest freedom that we could ever have is that freedom to become all that God wants us to be with each other in Him. So we're going to have a moment of communion. Pastor Mike's going to come and lead this. Communion is a wonderful time for us to take a look at ourselves once again and ask ourselves, is there anything in this story that kind of touched my heart where I am? Are there any thoughts in my head today, any ambitions, goals I have that kind of parallel this Jacob fellow? Am I ready to switch my name from Jacob to Israel? Am I willing to surrender my rights, what I think is important, my gifts and talents, God, so that we can become who God wants us to be as His children?